CN Live's daily report on the extradition hearing of Julian Assange at Old Bailey in London. This is Joe Lauria for CN Live. Today was day 7. It was an extraordinary day of testimony by 2 defense witnesses. They more or less focused again on the issue of informants. The government continues to press the case that they are only going after Assange, or being done for, as the phrase was in the court, was being done for simply revealing names of informants. So that was the key element that went through the testimony of both John Goetz, who is a German reporter at the time for Der Spiegel magazine in 2010, when Spiegel worked with Guardian, the New York Times, and El País to put out the Afghan and war logs, as well as the diplomatic cables. And the other witness was someone that I think was shown deference more than anybody else who's been up there, and he deserved it, of course. This is a famous man, even in Great Britain, and that, of course, is Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers whistleblower. There were 3 points about the informants that the 2 defense witnesses made that need to be set out right here at the beginning in our report. Now, first, I'm making this point, although it was made earlier by witnesses last week. One is that it is not against the law to reveal the names of informants. There was an attempt to make it against the law in the Senate in 2010. It was defeated. Number 2, Assange did not reveal the unredacted archive of the diplomatic cables first, with the names of informants in it. And 3, not a single informant has been known to be harmed by the revelation of their names. And it was not a decision by Assange to reveal those names unredacted. It was done because it had been revealed by other parties, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. I think John Goetz tried to set the record straight, that this was the sequence of events, and this is really key to understanding this. And he was given wide latitude to lay this out for the benefit of the Judge Vanessa Barreza, who will make this decision ultimately about whether Assange goes to Virginia or not, maybe with a big assist by Lady Arbuthnot, who, of course, is the chief magistrate. Assange worked to redact the documents, Goetz said. He worked with all the others to do that. It was of course, was his answer. And he stressed that Assange was even, at the time, he thought paranoid and over the top and exaggerated in the necessity of securing these documents so that they wouldn't in no way be leaked out. And Goetz said that this was all new at the time. First of all, the idea of partnering several newspapers, competitors together, was something completely new and not easy to deal with at first. The Guardian, El País, and Der Spiegel. But also that the idea of working with somebody like Assange and working with classified documents and encryptophones and very secure methods that WikiLeaks and Assange knew all about, and it seems these legacy media guys didn't, but this was 2010. He says now, when he looks back on it, he understands why Assange was being so paranoid. He wasn't being paranoid. He was being super careful about these documents. So he also points out that Assange would approach the U.S. government, the White House and the State Department, for help in documents that had names that should be redacted and for technical assistance from the government and finding those documents, because searching through these tens of thousands of documents proved to be a problem at that time to find names. They didn't know the names. So Goetz testified that the government was helping them. And then he thinks they stopped because they realized that they were pointing the journalists in the direction of good stories. So they stopped cooperating with them. Dan Ellsberg later made an enormously important intervention on this point, which I'll get to, about Assange asking the government for help. So the documents went out little by little. The journalists from the 3 news organizations did their stories, and then Assange started making partnerships with local media in various countries that they would find stories in this trench that would be of newsworthy and of importance to the local populations that those newspapers reported to. And at that time, WikiLeaks was, as Goetz testified, had invested a lot of time and money into slowly, a year, they plan to slowly roll out these documents and redacting them as best as they could. And suddenly in the book that James Lewis, the prosecutor, is fond of quoting from, the book by David Lee and Luke Harding of The Guardian, published, I believe, in April of 2011, they, for some reason that has never been explained to me or perhaps anyone else, published the password that would release the encrypted archive of all of the unredacted cables that WikiLeaks was going to slowly roll out over a year, and redacting them as they did that. Suddenly this password was out there, and it wasn't until, I believe, August of 2011 that a newspaper in Germany, the Freitag, Friday newspaper, saw this in the book, and they were about to publish this password. And Goetz says that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks desperately tried to stop Freitag from publishing the unredacted cables. Why? Because Assange did not want the names of these informants to go out unredacted, but Freitag did so anyway. And then there may have been some other websites, but the main one that had the technical knowledge and skill to use this password to open the archives was Cryptome, which is an American website that has been publishing dumps of documents for a long time. Published in February, of 2011, not April. That's the Harding Lee book. So Cryptome, which is in the business of dumping documents, dumped, in this case, unredacted documents out there on September 1, 2011. Now, James Lewis, the prosecutor, was trying to say, and throughout this day and throughout this hearing, that Assange recklessly put these names out there and that this is exactly what the government's going after him for, despite the fact there's no law against it, and that he's not being prosecuted for anything else, which the defense, by reading out parts of the indictment, and various defense witnesses have clearly shown is not true. He's being charged with other matters. Cryptome published it on September 1. WikiLeaks published the unredacted archives on September 2nd. And the understanding that I have was the reasoning was for WikiLeaks that they wanted now informants to know that their names were in the documents so they could get to safety if necessary, because their names were out there already, because of the negligence or the intention, not known to me why David Lee and Luke Harding published that password, but it was out there and Cryptome cracked it, opened it, and published it. So how could the government, one must ask, now contend that Julian Assange has blood on his hands for the purposeful uncovering of these informants' names? And we'll get to the other issue later, because Julian Assange, Ellsberg dealt a lot with the idea that no one was actually harmed from this. Goetz's testimony ended, and this was, people who know about what John Goetz has said already about a particular incident, we were all waiting for him to testify on this. Earlier in these proceedings, James Lewis, the prosecutor, reading from the David Lee, Luke Harding book, and Lewis has never mentioned Harding for some reason, but he did praise David Lee as one of the most outstanding investigative journalists in Great Britain. Lewis has previously read from the book where, at a dinner party during this period in 2010, when the Guardian, El País, and the Spiegel were working with the New York Times to release these files, that there was a dinner party, and Assange was said by David Lee and Luke Harding to have said he didn't care whether informants were killed, they deserved it, something to that effect. We've known for some time now that John Goetz has released a statement, now it turns out as early as 2011, and he's been quoted in the press saying that that is not true, that Assange never said that. So we're all kind of waiting intently to see when the moment would arrive in this testimony for Goetz to be asked about that. What happened at that dinner? Since Lewis put this on the record, it's in the court transcripts that Assange allegedly said these things. And here is a direct witness, not hearsay, someone who was present, who could refute that. And as Edward Fitzgerald, was it? Or Summers? Mark Summers, the defense attorney, was leading to this last question. He left this for last, I guess, to create and leave the best impression. About to asking about the dinner, Lewis jumped to his feet, objected, He said he couldn't be asked about this dinner at the restaurant. Why? Because it wasn't in the written testimony of John Goetz. And that if the if the defense wanted to ask him about it, they should have had him file a supplemental witness statement. Well, this is a technicality, and I guess you know where I'm going with this. Vanessa Paredes, of course, agreed with the government, with the U.S. government, and their prosecutor, James Lewis, saying that he could not be asked about the dinner. Mark Summer tried to put up an argument why he should be, but that's how it ended. So Goetz was never asked about what happened at that dinner, and that was a major blow, I think, not taking anything away from the other very important testimony of this journalist, but he wasn't able to talk about that dinner, and that was a disappointment. Then there was a long argument about the testimony of Khaled al-Mazari. Khaled was a German Lebanese who was kidnapped by the CIA and brought to Albania, where he was sodomized and tortured and then ultimately released. Why I'm bringing this up is because John Goetz mentioned in his testimony that he worked on this story, as this was a German citizen, and he was able even to go to North Carolina and find the CIA agents who actually did this kidnapping. Based on that report, that was a cover story in Der Spiegel, the prosecutors in Munich came up with an arrest warrant, except the arrest warrant was not issued in the United States or for the United States, but only in Germany, when the suspects, the two CIA agents, were in North Carolina or somewhere in the US. And he brought this up and was asked about this by Summers because it led him to explain that it was when WikiLeaks released diplomatic cables, the first thing he looked for, Goetz, was whether there was anything about this case, and indeed there was, and there were diplomatic cables that showed that the United States threatened Germany for serious repercussions in U.S.-German relations if they should issue this arrest warrant for these men in the U.S., and they never did. It was only issued in Germany. Now, Mark Summers wanted to put in the record the testimony directly from al-Mazri, and in fact, that was never resolved. The government objected. Lewis said that was, they didn't accept that as evidence, and there would have to be an admissibility battle. They went off for about an hour to discuss maybe how to edit this document, and apparently they never came to a conclusion about that. So we went into the second part of the testimony, the afternoon, and there was Daniel Ellsberg from his home, his basement in Berkeley, California, wearing a suit and giving testimony. He was sworn in, and Ellsberg began by comparing WikiLeaks, this is now under direct examination from the defense, comparing WikiLeaks releases to the Pentagon Papers. And he was explaining about the very, very high public interest and the need for the public to know. And he said it was the first time in 40 years that he'd seen documents released that showed patterns of policy and revealed, just like in Vietnam, that the Afghan war had been going very badly and the public was not being informed about that. Of course, the Pentagon Papers showed that successive administrations were lying about winning in Vietnam when they knew all along they were not winning, but they kept the murders and the massacres going, even of U.S. soldiers, for political reasons, to save face. And Ellsberg is saying that Assange's work in WikiLeaks was very, very similar to the Pentagon Papers. He said when he met Julian Assange in London that he immediately felt an affinity with him, particularly on issues of transparency and about trying to do something to stop two wars, or in Assange's cases, two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, and in Ellsberg's case, one in Vietnam. Ellsberg made a very interesting statement from this virtual stand about the documents that Chelsea Manning leaked about Afghanistan and Iraq, that these were low-level documents that explained how the U.S. was involved in torture and assassination programs. And what Ellsberg says was that back in the Vietnamese days, that kind of information that talked about U.S. torture and assassination programs would have been only in the most highly secret documents that only top level, I'm talking about top people at the White House, State Department, Defense Department, the secretaries and the president and a few other people would see. But he said that that would never have appeared in the low-level documents that he himself wrote. He said when he was in the embassy working for the U.S. and the U.S. embassy in Saigon, and that showed to him how far we've come since that. That now this has been normalized. Torture, assassination programs normalized. Where in the '60s in Vietnam, the U.S. government wanted no one to know about these highly secret programs. Now they put them into low-level field reports that thousands of people had security clearance to read. And I thought that was a very interesting intervention by Assange there. I'm sorry, by Dan Ellsberg, corrected by my producer. Thank you very much. Lewis was on that. The defense attorney Summers, I believe it was then, or was it no Fitzgerald had taken over then. Edward Fitzgerald was asking Ellsberg to lay out what it was like when he testified in his trial for the leaking of the Pentagon Papers. Was he allowed to explain his motive and intentions? And Ellsberg says that, in fact, he had withheld saying in press interviews or anywhere else what his intentions were because he wanted to display that in his court. And when he tried to explain that, he was cut off by the government, objecting, and the judge continued to sustain these objections. And finally, Ellsberg's lawyer asked the judge, why can't he, he's never heard of a case where someone who's accused of doing something is not allowed to explain why he did it. And the judge replied, well, you have now. This is the first case. And Ellsberg said that every national security case like that since, or any highly politicized case like that, the defendants are not allowed to explain the political reasons for doing what they're accused of doing. And that he, based on that, he says Julian Assange wouldn't remotely get a free trial inside the US because, again, he would not be able to explain the purpose for publishing these documents that he did. Now, Lewis then went on to the cross-examination. He seemed, as I said, a little more respectful of Dan Ellsberg than he has with some of the others, although it did break down at certain points, and his bullying tactics did emerge at a certain point. But he was trying to first say that the Collateral murder video, which Ellsberg had raised, that Assange was not being charged for that. He's made that point several times. The Collateral murder video was not classified. Chelsea Manning has said that. That might be one reason he's not being prosecuted for it. Another reason may be the government doesn't want draw any attention to this clear evidence, prima facie evidence of war crimes, and that's what Ellsberg said about that. So, but the issue is the rules of engagement that he is being charged for, although Lewis tried to say he wasn't. Ellsberg tried to correct him. And the rules of engagement were leaked and they were classified by Chelsea Manning and published by WikiLeaks because it showed that this video of the murder of people on a street in Baghdad went against the rules of engagement. In other words, US pilots should not have done what they did. And Ellsberg pointed out that had the government responded by saying the rules of engagement were broken, and if they had prosecuted or at least investigated the pilots involved in that video, where you hear them laughing as they're killing people and blaming the people for bringing children to the battlefield, children who have been wounded, that had the government investigated, perhaps prosecuted that, and said the rules of engagement were broken, then he thinks the American public would have accepted that. But the fact that they didn't, again, shows the mentality has changed since Vietnam. Don't forget the My Lai incident. It was investigated, and Seymour Hersh broke that story. He wound up getting a full-time job at the New York Times, and the whistleblower who gave it to him got to write to the State Department and Congress and worked with the U.S. investigators. In this case of the Collateral murder, the whistleblower, Chelsea Manning, went to jail, and the journalist is in jail as well. He didn't get a promotion. So this is part of what is the ongoing and deepening corruption. I think Ellsberg was trying to make that point, that this is a different time now. Another reason why he thinks Assange would not get a free trial, a fair trial. So this attempt by Lewis again to say that he was only being charged for revealing the names of informants is just contradicted by the facts of the indictment, which have him charged for possession of documents and retaining of documents. other documents, not the ones only with informants, other classified documents. Ellsberg again made the point that John Goetz did in the morning that Assange carefully worked to redact these names from the informants, and he made an extraordinary statement that in the publishing of the Pentagon Papers, or in his leak rather of the Pentagon Papers, he did not redact one name of an informant and even a CIA agent, and he knew it was illegal. While it's not illegal to name an informant, it is illegal to uncover the name of a CIA agent. He even did that. And the reason he said he did that was because if there were any redaction in it, it would open people up to question the veracity of the entire study of the war in Vietnam that the Pentagon had commissioned and that he worked on for the Rand Corporation. So he didn't redact anyone, and he was very clear about that Assange had done more to redact the names of informants than he had done with the Pentagon Papers. He also rejected this idea. He said when WikiLeaks first made news in 2010 that suddenly he was being called for media interviews and whatnot, and he was seeing his name being portrayed as good Ellsberg and bad Assange. That Ellsberg was a good guy because he leaked documents that showed the war was wrong, but somehow Assange is a bad guy. And he tried to refute that. He said he totally disagrees with that characterization of himself because Assange did try to redact names for one thing and he didn't, and that they were both doing the same thing, trying to stop wars, trying to stop the war in Vietnam and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq by revealing this classified information that the public had a right to know. And Ellsberg made another really important and interesting set of statements that backed up and expanded on what Goetz had said. When Goetz said that Assange had approached the White House and State Department for help in finding out which documents they should look for and which names to remove, and also technical help to find that, Ellsberg followed it up by saying he had also approached the Pentagon and the State Department, and they refused to help him. This is a really key point. Ellsberg says the Department of Defense and the State Department refused to help Assange to redact these names. And he gave a theory why he thinks that happened. He thinks it's because they could then later charge Assange. They already knew that he was leaking these documents. He was already in the government's crosshairs. Ellsberg thinks that the government didn't help to redact them so they can get evidence that he had revealed the names of informants to try to prosecute him. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's quite an interesting point to make. So Lewis responded by saying, so it's all the government's fault then, wasn't it? It's all the government's fault. Ellsberg just stood his ground and said, yes, I think they bear a very heavy responsibility. And he went on to say that he believed government officials are highly cynical in this entire matter because they didn't care enough to help redact those names. So how could they now be trying to say that Assange put these lives in danger, let alone the fact it's not against the law and that it was published first by Krypton because of the password from the Guardian journalists? How could, and that Assange published afterward, and he tried to redact names. How could the government be trying to make such an issue of Assange having blood on his hands, as they once said about Ellsberg, when they themselves didn't help him to redact them? And it was highly cynical, he said. And in addition to that, a government that took part in wars in which 1 million people in the Middle East have died in the last 19 years, and 37 million people, I believe he said, were made refugees. How could these people be now complaining about Assange leaving some informants' names there? And then we got into a back and forth with Lewis about whether anyone was actually harmed. And Mr. Lewis went to Gordon Kromberg's affidavit. He's asked virtually every defense witness whether he's read it or she's read it, and why was it not put in their witness statements. Well, guess what? Dan Ellsberg read, I think it's 36 pages, read it last night, the night before his testimony. And I don't think that was good news for Mr. Lewis, because he went through a total, a long recitation of what's in Kromberg's statements about people who've been disappeared, about Chinese dissidents who had been harassed and called rats, and others who had to flee the country because they were. Ellsberg came back and said he understood the anxiety, and that's understandable, but was one person harmed? Lewis came back and said, Kronberg's talking about all these people who disappeared. And he read it out, and on objection, defense attorney Lewis said, read the rest of it, and the rest of it said the government has no evidence to link any of these disappeared people with the WikiLeaks release. So that was a very key moment when Ellsberg pushed back on whether any one of these informants that were first released by others and not Assange, and Assange worked hard to try to redact them and even asked the government to help him redact it before publication. He's being accused of this. I mean, if this today wasn't, to a fair-minded judge, enough evidence to show that at least this part of the argument of the government, that he's being charged only with releasing informants' names and also with conspiring with Chelsea Manning to hack into the computer, as we know from the other indictment, this wasn't enough to show that the government has a very, very shaky case. I really do not know. So I will conclude there by saying that Assange did at one point, I don't know if I said, did speak out at the court during the questioning of Ellsberg, and he was warned again if he didn't stop, he would be removed from the court. We couldn't make out exactly what he said, but it was he was upset about what Lewis was going on about him endangering informants, I believe. Before we wrap up tonight, I want to just ask everyone, if they can, to please go to patreon.com/CNLive to help make these video reports possible and continuing. We really do need your support. We really appreciate the numbers of people who have been watching our reports. And tomorrow there are 2 more witnesses that are going to come on the stand for the defense. Check Consortium News for our live updates throughout the day, beginning 5 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. British Standard Time, and also our live tweets. Our producer, Kathy Vogan, is live tweeting the events that we are following on our screen, coming directly from Old Bailey. So we're in a somewhat rare position, because not many reporters are doing that, to report the details of the events and to recap it on these videos each night. So until tomorrow, this is Joe Lauria for CN Live. Goodbye.